It's April 4th, 2020, and thank you for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's latest Saturday webinar in our American Minds series for the 2019-2020 school year. The focus of today's program was Douglas MacArthur, and joining us were moderator Dr. Chris Burkett of Ashland University, panelists Dr. John Moser, also of Ashland University, and Dr. Tom Brashino of the United States Army War College. Thanks for listening.
Well, welcome everybody to another Teaching American History.org Saturday webinar sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach history and political science at Ashland University and in our master's program. The theme of our webinar series this year, for those of you who have joined us before, you know this, but if you're joining us for the first time, let me point this out. Our theme is American Minds, and our purpose is to pull together some thoughtful scholars to have an interesting, lively conversation about 10 individuals who either influenced or somehow reflect this idea of an American mind. And we encourage all of you to join us today in that conversation by submitting questions via the chat box. As always, we'll try to get to as many as possible. But please, if you don't mind, when you submit a question, submit it to all participants rather than to me privately. And that way, our panelists can see those questions as well and jump on them if they'd like to, without having to wait for me to throw them out there. So in the next week, you'll receive an email with a link by which you can request a certificate of participation. And that will also include a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. So today we're talking about General Douglas MacArthur, and I have two very thoughtful gentlemen here today to help us think about MacArthur. One is Thomas Brashino of the United States Army War College, and John Moser, my colleague here at Ashland University. So we're trying to get Tom hooked up here, audio and video, and hopefully he'll be able to join us soon. But John, I'm very grateful for your time this morning. Always enjoy our webinars together. I don't see you much in person. I actually see you more on webinars these days than in person.
That's pretty much everybody except my wife and child. I see more in person.
And it looks like Tom may have been able to join us. Tom, are you there? He may not have his audio working yet. Tom, if you can hear me, jump in at some point, please, and just let us know that you can hear us and we can hear you. So I typically start by throwing out a pretty broad question to start the conversation, and then we'll see where it goes from here. But John, obviously MacArthur is one of the great military figures in American history, but also very controversial in some ways. So, in your opinion, what's MacArthur's greatest accomplishment? And then maybe on the flip side, what's the most controversial thing about MacArthur, in your opinion?
I'm gonna cheat and choose two of his greatest accomplishments. The way he conducted the New Guinea campaign in World War II, I thought was excellent. I mean, his strategy in the Southwest Pacific in general was outstanding. The other is masterminding the landing in Incheon during the Korean War, which literally did turn the tide of that. Those were his greatest moments. You didn't ask for his worst moments. You said most controversial.
Well, you can do both.
They're similar. I mean, there's definitely overlap there. The way he handled the Philippine campaign in end of 1941, early 1942, especially doing nothing for that critical period of hours after he had been informed of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and really did nothing to prepare against an attack against the Philippines, even though a Japanese attack on the Philippines seemed a lot more likely than a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Where the controversy comes from is not only this very strange error in judgment, but the fact that the guy's personality was so grandiose. I really like the T. Harry Williams, the great historian, American historian from Louisiana, T. Harry Williams, that I believe Tom identified this article. I really like the way that he said America has always had generals like Eisenhower and generals like MacArthur, and they're extremely different. That MacArthur is really kind of a throwback to an older era before you had to take into account domestic politics and the pressures of democracy. The famous statement about him was he doesn't have staff, he has a court that surrounds him. So there you go.
That's great. Yeah, that's fantastic. Great start. Tom, can you hear us okay? Tom?
Hello.
Hey, Tom, we can hear you.
Hey.
We can't see you, but at least we can hear you.
Yeah.
There we go.
Are you all set?
I'm all set.
All right, great. Thanks for joining us. I at the beginning, I like to kind of throw out a general question. The question I threw out, and John just gave his. I'm not sure if you could hear any of his answer, but I asked your opinion on MacArthur's greatest accomplishment, maybe the single thing that he should be remembered for as a great achievement, and then John threw out his maybe most controversial or worst moment about MacArthur. Do you have an opinion on those two things?
Oh, I guess we. Well, what did John say?
John, go ahead.
I said best was the New Guinea campaign and the Southwest Pacific in general, and the Inchon landing. I said worst was the failure to take precautions after for the Philippines after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then just spoke in general about his failure to appreciate pressures of domestic politics.
Fair assessment, Tom?
Yeah, let me take this a slightly different way. I think that the success of the Inchon campaign is probably his greatest achievement, and it's also probably the most overrated and problematic in all of his stuff. I think I think it's like sort of perfectly captures MacArthur because it's brilliant, but it's kind of brilliant in a bunch of un-American, sort of out of his era ways that and it becomes this kind of standard we use for military genius, but it's not a very good standard for American military. And I think that the later mistakes, the later problems that he has in Korea are directly attributable to the successes he has at Incheon. His belief that this is the way to do things. I just, having studied this era a lot, and these guys and his contemporaries, or I guess he's a little bit older than everybody else, but his or half a generation at least, or a generation older than everybody else. He fights both in World War II and in Korea. It's just how out of step he is with all the rest of it. And I think that Incheon is an example of that. So I'm always a little bit skeptical. It's not a great answer to your question, but his greatest success. I was sort of thinking about MacArthur in a little bit different way. So and then I was also thinking my role here might be a little bit more of his earlier career and the stuff that we don't generally talk about. So I think he has some great accomplishments at San Miel and in the Meuse-Argonne in World War I, 42nd Division. But even those kind of show some of his problems too. So I think so. To more directly answer your question, I'd say his greatest ability is this is his way that he's able to be an inspiring leader, a enormously inspiring leader at times, and then also his greatest failure is that he swings wildly to the other side and is this terrible disaster of leader at other times. He's one of the most fascinating characters for all those reasons.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think he I mean, you described him as being sort of out of step in a way and swinging wildly at times. What's that the result of? I mean, not to get too psychological here, but is that just his personality? Is that who he is, or is this the result of, as John was suggesting, the sort of earlier era of military thinking and training and experience that he grew out of? He spent some time in Mexico. He was it the Veracruz? He was part of the Veracruz incident. And he's around other. I mean, did he know Patton, for example? He was about the same era as Patton, right?
Yeah, I mean, Patton was quite a bit junior of him. That's he's so old. I mean, it's amazingly old for his peers. The only guy who's that's right around his age is Marshall. I think Marshall's a year younger than him, I believe.
Okay.
I think Marshall's 81 and he's 1881, and MacArthur's 1880. I think there's a bit of an era thing there for MacArthur. That one of the reasons I think he's so out of step is if you look at his career, this is this era when the United States Army starts to professionalize and have a well-developed school system. For officers, once they get past West Point, we tend to focus in on West Point because MacArthur has that connection because he goes back as the commandant and he's a graduate. But what's more important in this era to those senior leaders is that they go through the Command and General Staff College at Leavenworth, and they go through the Army War College then in Washington, D.C. And he doesn't do either of those things. So he's not there for either of those things. So it's not just that he doesn't get the same education, it's that he's not even sort of in with his peers. So he doesn't have this sort of common frame of reference for looking at war that all of his peers have, which is, I think, is part of this, and some of the lessons that they had developed over time. And then there's that whole thing of him just being like never in the United States. He spends an enormous amount of time overseas, away from everybody else. He's got that this little period as the chief of staff of the Army, and he's the commandant. He bounced around a little bit, but he spends a lot of time out in the Philippines. He spends a lot of time in other places. And then he has that ability. Even the Veracruz is a great example of a MacArthur thing. So he does this. They cite it out on the webpage for him that he does this great heroic scouting mission to the west of Veracruz to sort of look for paths to potentially do. Because they occupy Veracruz, and there's a thought they might go to Mexico City. Frederick Funston's in command at this point. The Marines seize it, and then Frederick Funston takes command. And there's this idea that maybe they'll, just like Winfield Scott had done, they'll go to Mexico City. And he does this scouting expedition, and he kind of does it on his own. And this is one of these cases where he gets nominated for a Medal of Honor, but it was either he was going to get the Medal of Honor or he was going to get court-martial. Because he almost starts a war. He almost expands this into a full-bore war, which because he kind of does this on his own. So it's just another great example of him being telling my students here yesterday that he's got that MacArthur's he's the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. So
that's a great way to put it. Yeah, I mean, but even his commanding officer, I think, supported his decision to act on his own. I think, right, and supported his recommendation for his medal, I believe. I get your point, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the complicated part with that one is that Frederick Funston, who is the commander, was a protege of Arthur MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's father.
Oh, I see.
And maybe even more than a protege of it, since Frederick Funston's first child was named Arthur MacArthur Funston. Who eventually died of whooping cough, I believe. But so Frederick Funston had this odd little, how do I take care of this? I got to take care of this guy. This is my, Arthur MacArthur, we clearly respected so much he named his child after him. That he has to deal with his kid kind of running amok, and then hearing it from mom if he isn't nice to him. So I think there's that. It is this delicate little issue that goes on in the Veracruz, the whole Veracruz story.
So he didn't receive the medal, but maybe Funston's support was enough to save him from the court-martial.
Yeah, it's nothing came of it. So it was one of these interesting cases. Since nothing came of it, I think he was able to kind of get away with it. But yes, they were well outside the American lines, and that was the problem.
I see.
Case. It got real hairy for a second there. And
yeah,
I kind of had to protect him on it.
So we got a couple of questions coming in already on this theme that we're talking about now. So a couple of questions and observations. Let me see if I can scroll up here. From Randy. Randy asked, does his failure to recognize the threat to the Philippines and then to Korea stem from his hubris? Does it demonstrate that the thing that makes him great is also his greatest flaw? Then Jim asked, do you think that his staying out of the country was intentional on his point, or because the military leadership wanted him out of the country? So thoughts on either of those two things, gentlemen?
I'm trying to look at the chat here. Questions.
Yeah, these are at the very end. They just came in as you were talking, Tom.
No, I don't think I don't. Still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think it's intentional. It's just the way that careers go. One of these, a little bit of a myth of American military history. I think that Americans are connected from the rest of the world, and that the offshore force sort of out there as much as they are, even prior to the 20th century. So, a lot of these guys went out and had responsibilities out in the Pacific in particular for a big chunk of their career. So I don't think there was anything deliberate about it. I just think he ended up getting that. I mean, they all cycle through. He tended to stay. But then keep in mind too that in the late 30s, he's in that weird semi-retired from the U.S. military, and he's a field marshal or whatever in the Philippine Army. Takes on that thing, which but he still has regular guys who are American Army guys who are his aides, including Eisenhower. So
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. It's also worth remembering that the U.S. military establishment is very small during this period, and there's not a whole lot for them to do within the continental United States. So where are they going to go? They're going to go on mission also.
Yeah, I was just going to mention. Sorry, I had to forgot to unmute myself. One of the documents that we asked people to take a look at is his it's called The Noblest Development of Mankind. I'm not sure which of you recommended that, if either of you recommended that, but I had not read that speech before. And that's a really interesting speech, given at just the tail end of this period you were just mentioning, John, right? The period of reducing the size of the military and the importance of the military. I found this to be a really fascinating speech, not just because of how he talks about America and what America means to him, but how he frames this in the context of the importance of maintaining sort of preparedness to defend these things that are most important, right? In light of his understanding of what's the accomplishments of American Western civilization as a whole. So, but I just found that a very fascinating speech given at this moment. I think it was in 35 or 36. He was essentially stepped down as he was chief of staff. Am I right about that at this time? Yeah.
Correct. Yes, he was.
So again, can we talk a little bit about his? I think a lot of students want to talk, or participants want to talk about World War II, the Philippines, and Korea. But Tom, you mentioned he had a lot of early accomplishments. Clearly made a name for himself and a reputation for himself. Can you guys talk a little bit about, say, pre-World War II? What were some of the things that allowed him to make his name as an important person in the military? I mean, for example, he's known as one of the creators of the 42nd Division, right? The Rainbow Division, which I always find fascinating. I didn't know much about it. Just down the road, John, by the way, from Ashland on 42, there was a sign. Do you remember the sign commemorating the Rainbow Division? And I always wondered why that was there, by the way, because I didn't think Ohio National Guard units were part of the Rainbow Division, but he did things like that, right? That clearly established himself as an important figure. Some other things that he was known for before World War II.
Well, he overhauled West Point at a critical time. I mean, West Point during World War I had basically become nothing more than an officer training school. And he turned it into in fact, there was a lot of pressure to keep it no more than a 3-year program, and he insisted on it being a 4-year institution. Developed West Point athletics to the extent, really helping to make it what it is today, but also making it a serious academic institution as well. I'm sure Tom has lots of other things he could add.
Trying to improve the connection. Yeah, he has a pretty interesting career and how he goes, and it was a World War One career as in the 42nd Division. I think that it's a mix of some Guard units, and then they draft. This is one of the first ones where they draft guys from all over the country. Take the selective service guys. I think that's part of the reason why they call it the Ranger Division. Pull from all over. There's probably some Ohio guys in there. I'm not completely sure. It's an interesting thing there too, because he's this is one of these places where he ends up being the difference in most of the guys. And one, he's a line commander. He stays in the line, doesn't really do much staff work in World War One, and he becomes the brigade commander, one of the brigade commanders of the second division. He's only the division commander for right at the end, I believe, for a period. He's commanding there. He's a very good combat commander. Sort of, you look at his World War One experience, and that reputation of dugout Doug that he gets later on doesn't really match his World War One. He's definitely in the front lines and in the fight all the time. So he's definitely good at that, and he has such a good reputation as a combat leader in World War One that he's one of very few guys who doesn't get knocked down rank. He actually keeps his rank as a brigadier general, in part because he gets the job as the commandant at West Point, which is a brigadier general job. But almost everybody else goes way back down, even guys who are high up in command. I mean, there's George Cameron is a corps commander, a 3-star level command, and he goes down to being a colonel after the war. So you have some of that. Now he also was removed. He also gotten pulled out of his position. But yeah, so MacArthur does that. That's his sort of big combat accomplishment. He becomes one of the famous guys for it, and I think Pershing even sort of lists him as maybe the finest, one of the finest combat officers that they have in World War One. And he is good, although again, you sort of see some of his problems in the war and in his perspective later on. After San Miel, and I won't get into the details of it. He's one of these guys who he says he goes out there with a couple of guys and they sort of scout the German positions. At San Miel, famously, the Americans had to stop because they had decided to do the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and they completely changed direction on this fight. And MacArthur goes out there and says, "Oh, you've just given me my brigade. I could have gone to Metz. He couldn't have gone to Metz. He would have gotten killed. It would not have gone well." But it's kind of in his sort of mentality, not understanding what requires to sustain large units. He has an issue with this that sort of shows up later. So you even see it in World War One. So that's his sort of World War One experience. But going back to this point about this speech, and as the chief of staff, it's a particular problem for him because he's chief of staff during the Great Depression, and it's one of these interesting kind of. In MacArthur's case, it happens to be true because it's the Great Depression that they're not preparing, and the Army doesn't have all that it needs in order to be prepared for the potential next fight. But it is one of these big tropes in American military history that the United States has never prepared. And it's a trope that is driven. It's mostly true, but it's not entirely true. I mean, I think all of you have probably seen these things. I think some of these readings, MacArthur certainly says it. We like to say, we have the 19th largest army in the world at the outbreak of, pick World War I, World War II, smaller than Portugal or something like that, or we pick these, some medium power and show just how pathetic we are. It's only partially true. So we like to exaggerate. So MacArthur's in this era of it's a common thing for military leaders, chiefs of staff of the army, to exaggerate the lack of preparedness. This goes on until today, even with our very large military establishment that we have now. They still are always saying, "Yes, we're not ready. We're not ready. We're not ready. Give us more money, give us more money. You got to keep in mind, military officers, professional military officers, leaders of the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines are not historians. That's not their job. Their job is to represent their institution. So they have a tendency to shape the history to fit them a little bit better. And so they'll emphasize lack of preparedness. And that's part of what MacArthur's doing here. This is right at the tail end of his term as chief of staff of the Army.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Billy actually had submitted a question on this point earlier, asking about the speech in the context of 1935. Do either of you know, did this get him in trouble at all with FDR, or FDR's reaction to this with everything that's going on? We know.
I don't know if how he reacted to this speech in particular, but there was a famous instance where there was a meeting and FDR floated the idea of reducing the military budget by 25%, and MacArthur basically flipped out on the president, and I don't remember the quote. Tom probably does, but at the end, Roosevelt said, "Don't talk to never talk to me like that," but basically, it's a good point, and he backed off on the proposal. Apparently, according to legend, MacArthur went outside and vomited on the steps after that.
That's fascinating. How just on this point, how directly was Roosevelt involved in the selection and appointment of high-ranking military commanders going into World War II? Do we know, or did he tend to leave those things to others? And part of the reason I ask this is because, despite this incident, John, clearly he didn't oppose MacArthur being appointed to command in the Pacific. So,
yeah, I think FDR's attitude toward MacArthur was he was a little bit intimidated by him, and wanted to keep him close and wanted to keep him happy to the extent that he could. FDR also was not afraid to. Well, it is strongly suspected that Roosevelt essentially blackmailed him at one point to keep him from becoming openly critical. The situation was the President Quezon of the Philippines gave him $500,000 as sort of a this was after the war had started. Gave him $500,000 after he had actually left the Philippines, and it was sort of back payment for MacArthur's job as trying to organize the Philippine Army. But had it gotten out in the public, it would have really looked bad at this moment when things looked like they were falling apart in the Pacific. And apparently Roosevelt, he knew about this and suggested that he could make things hot for MacArthur if he mentioned them. But generally, to your larger question, generally speaking, FDR was willing to leave military matters to the generals. One big counterexample I can think of is when he said, "No way is George Marshall going to go and command the operation in Europe because I need Marshall here in Washington."
Fascinating. Well, I was, as you were talking, John, that was really interesting. But I was sort of scanning the chats, and man, there's a wide range of opinions on MacArthur. Before we maybe turn to some of his more specific actions as in World War II and then Korea, you just scroll down here a little bit.
If you'd like, I have that for John's point about so to get an idea of what he's talking about. And again, this is from MacArthur's memoirs, which should be taken with a boulder of salt sometimes. He says he exaggerates. Yeah, I'm generally a fan of memoirs, but MacArthur's the kind of people who give memoirs a bad name. But anyway, his his story of the dispute he's having with Roosevelt. What he says, in my emotional exhaustion, I spoke recklessly and said something to the general effect that when we lost the next war and an American boy lying in the mud with an enemy bayonet through his belly and an enemy foot on his dying throat spat out his last curse, I wanted the name not to be MacArthur but Roosevelt.
That's
So there you go. That's where the
that's
president
fun.
says you must not talk my way to the president. Then he went and threw up on the steps of the White House,
Wow,
according to him. So
amazing.
that's the story. Yeah, so I saw on here there was the bonus march one. I think that might be worth
Yeah,
talking about
yeah.
a second.
His actions during the bonus march, and then in light, especially in light of the fact that just after this he gave the Noblest achievement speech. Go ahead, Tom, please. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the bonus march is a really, I'm sorry, it's a really interesting story that is, I think it's gotten more, not really accurate in how it's described. So when the army goes in on the bonus march, now look, MacArthur goes in, he goes in, he exceeds Hoover's orders in terms of expelling them. He goes earlier than Hoover wanted, and it's somewhat more extreme. But I think most people would be surprised. They don't shoot at Americans. They don't shoot at these veterans. Now that if folks who don't know the bonus march story, the idea is after World War One, Congress granted bonuses to World War One veterans that were to be paid out later. I think around 1940, I believe, was the date of the start of the bonus payments were supposed to go out, kind of like retirement things, closer to that, and pension type payments. And these guys, because of the Depression, wanted the bonus to be paid early. There's some indication, and it's probably right, that there were communists involved in the bonus march. So this caused some angst about some danger of all this, what this could cause. By the time the army gets involved, and it goes into this, and MacArthur, and I'm not a huge fan of MacArthur, but I will say in this particular case, this is one of these sort of overwrought things. By the time the army gets in there, the only people who've been killed have been killed by D.C. police, Washington D.C. police, who had killed a couple of guys or a couple of shootings that had happened. When the army goes in and moves them out, Patton actually later on says, this is the great example of how to do this, because no one is killed. One infant dies in the course of them moving the people out of there. The infant, I mean, it's probably safe to say that this infant probably wasn't in the most healthy shape, living in a hut on the Anacostia Flats, which is not a great area from where they were camped. So this is like a newborn or something that was in there. That's it. Otherwise, they actually get them moving out, and they move them out pretty quickly, and it's not a big deal. Now, Roosevelt, being the good politician, is they come back. People don't realize the bonus marchers try to come back every year, and Roosevelt, being the good politician, he goes, "Hey, look, we completely appreciate you being here. We've got a spot for you down farther south where no one will ever see you, and it won't be a big deal, so it doesn't become the big political thing that it did with Hoover." But yeah, it's one of these kind of overwrought stories. Eisenhower's there, MacArthur's there, so everybody kind of uses this as an example of this harsh measure, and it's a pretty minor, I think, in the larger scheme of things. And one of the funny things you point out about this is some of Eisenhower will have whole chapter biographies about him about the bonus march, and next to nothing about the fact that he went and wrote the history of World War One, the battlefield history of World War One for the American armies and battlefields, the guide World War One, which probably was more important to him, his effort as his later life as the Supreme Commander in World War II in Europe. But it is one of these interesting, the way we get caught up in these big flashy things.
Yeah, it's funny. I've often wondered if the bonus march hadn't taken place in the summer of an election year, if it would have even really registered. And secondly, my recollection is FDR finally took the bonus marchers and sent them down to the Florida Keys, and a whole lot of them got killed off on a hurricane. Yeah.
Yeah, they get them jobs in the Florida, in the Keys, and they get killed in that real nasty hurricane. You're right. That's what happened.
It's fascinating. We've got a lot of great questions coming in, so I'm just going to keep going to the questions, if you don't mind, gentlemen. Stan asks an interesting question about possible comparisons between MacArthur and someone like George Custer. So any any parallels there worth discussing, and maybe just in general, what other great sort of historical figure or military figure even could we compare MacArthur to? I thought maybe this would be a fun question before we get into some of the more specifics of World War II and Korea.
Williams makes the comparison to McClellan, although he does so carefully because
Ooh.
MacArthur was a much better general than McClellan was. But in terms
Okay.
of his overall demeanor and his lack of patience with the political leadership, he looks at McClellan. Winfield Scott is another example. Old fuss and feathers during the Mexican War. One could look at if one expands this outside of the domain of U.S. history. General Wallenstein in the 30 Years' War might be seen as another example of a general who found it very difficult to play under the political rules that were placed on him. Ultimately, he was killed for it.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, John, I like you leave the American one. I think, yeah, so the Williams reading is good, and he does do the McClellan in the terms of the sort of lack of respect for political leadership. Clearly an issue with MacArthur. I think maybe you could also say as a general, I think Montgomery might be an interesting one to sort of think about as a comparison. Bernard Montgomery is a comparison, in part because much like Montgomery, MacArthur's got to be the star of every show. You'd be pretty hard pressed. We can do a pretty decent job of naming guys who served under Eisenhower alongside Bradley and stuff like that. I mean, name the British Field Army commanders, British and Canadian Field Army commanders. I mean, I know some of them because what I do for a living, but Montgomery doesn't generally, give the Miles Dempseys of the world much credit in his stuff. He's the star of everything. And just like with MacArthur, you don't see, Walton Walker in Korea, or you don't really see, you see much about Kruger or Reichelberger, Kenny, the guys who were his commanders with him in World War II. He's got that sort of, I'm going to be the star of every show here, and I think a little bit of an overestimation of his own genius. I think, which is how I think Montgomery was too.
It's fascinating. There's a great question from Julie, whose school is named after Douglas MacArthur. And I kind of want to, if you don't mind, Julie, I'm going to hold off on that toward the end because I think that might be a good sort of question to wrap things up toward the end of this. But can we sort of segue into World War II? And John, of course, mentioned at the beginning the controversy over his handling of the defense of the Philippines. But there's a point here, or a chat submitted by Michael. Gentlemen, as an Australian, we don't like MacArthur much. We feel he sidelined us in World War II, underappreciated Australian troops, gave us the dirty jobs, kept the headline grabbing jobs for the Americans. Are we justified in this opinion? Anybody want to tackle that?
I'm going to defer to Tom on that.
Yeah, so I think it's yes, absolutely, and I think it's even. I think you're right on, and let me maybe make this a little more specific for people. So MacArthur gets a lot of credit, especially from. Well, D. Clayton James does some of it, but then William Manchester in American Caesar picks this up and goes even farther with it. That MacArthur is this genius about this sort of island hopping, but also sort of jumping past enemy units instead of attacking them frontally. Does a good job of sort of skipping over them, leaving them behind. And the impression you get from a lot of these American folks and sort of MacArthur fans is that these units are left behind, these Japanese units are left behind to die on the vine, along the north coast of New Guinea, for example, which is a really brilliant campaign. But they're not left behind to die on the vine. They're left there for the Australians to go fight and clean up. And so so the Australians do get that dirty job of doing that. And this is a more important thing than this goes back to my initial point about Incheon. It's all well and good to sort of get behind the enemy, but one of the nature of modern field armies in the field is that they're extremely resilient to being destroyed. This isn't like the Napoleonic days, where you could early Napoleonic days where surround an enemy force, essentially destroy it, and then they completely collapse and fall apart. field armies that are organized into these big, large corps that each of these corps is like a little mini field army itself, are really resilient and very difficult to destroy in a single day. And MacArthur never seems to grasp this. It's like, hey, if I get behind them and I cause some sort of shock, then they'll collapse. It's a very German type approach to looking at war fighting. But the reality is that since these units are resilient and these large forces are resilient, you have to do something about them, or they're sitting on top of your lines of communication. If you want to keep progressing and keep moving forward, you're going to have to deal with those. And MacArthur had this habit of leaving that to other people. I'll leave that to somebody else, and we'll go to the next one, go to the next one, go to the next one. And he does that in World War II. And the Australians are this kind of forgotten story that's pretty good. And pretty new book about this called MacArthur's Coalition. That talks about the Australian role in much better terms. You wouldn't even know the Australians were in war.
It puts me in mind of the old saying: if you are in the enemy's rear, he is also in yours. But I wonder to what extent his dismissive attitude towards the Australians stems from the fact that he did not like the British and the British Empire at all. He was extremely critical, and even as he was solicitous of the Filipinos and the Japanese. I mean, he clearly had what you might call a progressive attitude on things like empire, and had a deep admiration for Asians in general.
Really, I didn't know that. It's fast. Well, that would help explain his maybe love of the Philippines in a certain way,
and his attitude during the occupation of Japan, which
very interesting.
We'll have a chance to talk about.
Yeah. No, that's great. So, for the sake of getting in, moving toward that, so John, you mentioned earlier the lack of preparation, which falls on MacArthur's shoulders, right, in the Philippines before the invasion. So can we talk a little bit about that and the scale to which that was a military disaster? And then after that, I still want to ask, though, despite the failure with the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, was MacArthur somehow still the right man for the job? I preface this by saying I've spoken with a lot of. Oh boy, can you still hear me?
I do. I can hear.
All right, my computer locked up for a second. As an undergrad, I interviewed, I think I've told you this, John, a lot of World War II POWs, including not just Americans, but among the Americans, several who were sort of felt as though they were left behind on the Philippines. And just gauging it by the sheer number of prisoners of war that were taken, it struck me as a huge disaster. Mm-hmm. So, am I exaggerating that too much, or am I justified in that view?
And I think their anger at him is understandable. However, it would have been a really big deal if MacArthur had been allowed to fall into Japanese hands. So that would have been a really serious blow to morale back home, because it's often said about MacArthur, he was very good at public relations, and even if we criticize his strategy for defending the Philippines, he becomes a symbol of resistance in the Pacific Theater during those dark weeks of early 1942, when place after place is falling to the Japanese. He's crying out for reinforcements. And where are U.S. forces going? Well, to the extent they're going anywhere, they're going to the UK, because FDR and most of the commanders are committed to this Europe first strategy. So MacArthur becomes a symbol of resistance, but also kind of this guy who's engaged in a doomed struggle. And of course, this becomes part of his this legend that he carries through to the rest of the war. Right? I shall return, and then eventually he does.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of the famous photograph that I think Billy maybe asked about earlier.
Yeah.
Which, on the one hand, go ahead, please. Go, John, please.
There was no staging. Well, let me take that back a little bit. There were two different photographs: his landing on Leyte and his landing on Luzon. And certainly in the case of Luzon, actually in both cases, he understood that the cameras were there. But these were two separate landings. Neither of these was staged in the sense of, oh, we've already done it, but this time I want to do it again for the cameras, like the Iwo Jima photograph. Yeah, that was not the case.
I see. But I mean, it's that famous photograph strikes a lot of people as a symbol of his arrogance, but it really was important for PR purposes, in a certain sense, as you were saying, John. So,
well,
and morale boosting purposes.
And the plan wasn't for him to have to wade ashore. It's just his landing craft got hung up. Yeah. So okay. Well, he went forward anyway.
It's pretty dramatic. It worked.
Yeah. Sure.
Tom, do you think MacArthur was the right man for the job in the Philippines?
Yeah. So this is a great question. There was no right man for that job. I mean, maybe there's some better and worse, but I don't know that anybody could have defended the Philippines. He certainly made his mistakes in there. Yeah, I don't generally try to be in the armchair general business, telling guys how to fight this better. As a matter of the historical record, this kind of goes back to my point about preparedness. They had done the United States military, Army, Navy, Joint Army, Navy planning for the whole at the war colleges, Army, Navy war colleges. They'd done extensive planning in terms of war plan or war with Japan, and by the late 1930s, the consensus was clearly that they could not hold the Philippines if the Japanese attacked large numbers. There's just no way they were going to be able to hold the Philippines. So they now again, he made some mistakes in terms of the slow reaction to the initial attack and all that stuff, but probably would have made no difference. They were always going to have to abandon the Philippines. They were always planning to go back to counterattack and come back. They knew that was the way it was going to go. And then in terms of leaving, he was ordered to leave by Franklin Roosevelt. The reasons that John pointed out. This would have been a terrible blow to American morale. But and here's where MacArthur is, and I don't know if it's deliberate and through thought, or if it's just his sort of romantic feeling towards the Philippines. His father had served there, he had served there as a young man, and then he goes back multiple times. But it aligns. We don't give the United States much credit in our foreign policy, and we're always sort of beating ourselves up about our mistakes. But one of those things is that we took on a responsibility with the Philippines. The United States took on a responsibility with the Philippines when it decided to occupy the archipelago after the Spanish-American War, after the Philippine War, and they decided to do this. And the Americans don't really want to do it. They talk about leaving, but there's always this concern about the defense of the Philippines. And he's not wrong, right? I mean, when you take on this responsibility, part of your responsibility is claiming to be in charge of this place, that you're going to go back and you owe that to the world. A lot of the credibility of the United States in the world is that, and this comes up later in World War II when they have the debate about whether or not to go to Luzon or go to Formosa instead. And a big part of this is an appearance thing that matters. Now, there's a lot of military considerations, primarily military reasons they go to Luzon and not Formosa as a part of the approach to Japan. But that said, there's also a key part of this that is, when he says he's going to return, he's it's about him, because it's always about him, but it's also about the United States. And I don't know that Americans have a great appreciation of this, but certainly that World War II generation of Filipinos. I happened, when I was working at the Center of Military History in Washington, D.C., we'd done a little bit of support for the movie Great Raid, based on the Ghost Soldiers book. And so we actually got to watch, they did the premiere of the movie in D.C., and because we had helped out with it, we got to go to the premiere. I was struck by one of the things in the audience was how many Filipino veterans of World War II were there, and extremely patriotic about the sort of the American Filipino effort together, that we were allies. And this was, they don't have a lot of that. You don't see a lot of that sort of angst about the United States there. And I think MacArthur kind of gets that right, that the symbol matters. If the United States, if we did take on this this responsibility that we owned it. We bought it, we own it. So we broke it or whatever, now we own it. So now we're gonna have to deal with it. So uh, and it matters in the world. So I think that's one of the things that he probably gets right. I'm not sure if he gets it right for the right reasons or if it's because it's personal for him, but he still gets it right. And it's one of those cases where having the guy go up on the beach, it matters. It's an important thing.
That's a great point, Tom, and especially you're connecting it back to the obligations imposed, well, that the United States imposes on itself in the Philippines and after the Spanish-American War, right? I think this may be connected to what John was suggesting when he had this kind of progressive view of these things. So yeah, when we say that we're taking responsibility for the protection and even civilization of the Philippines, that's a pretty serious obligation. So do you know, by the way, Tom or John, is this how MacArthur's father, Arthur MacArthur, ended up in the Philippines as part of that? I don't know much about his father. Was he there pretty shortly after the occupation of the Philippines? If you don't know, it's fine. I'm just curious.
His dad is I believe he starts off as so they send a corps to the Philippines. I believe he starts off in the initial, so the corps goes to the Philippines is initially for the Spanish-American War, the Spanish surrender, and then you have this sort of contested occupation of Manila. The Americans basically make a deal with the Spanish to go into Manila and take the town, and the Filipino insurgents. And again, keep in mind too, the Filipino is we're getting into the weeds here, but Filipino is a misnomer. There's not really say Filipino when it's especially then sort of the kind of tribal differences, the ethnic differences are huge. Tagalogs and Visayans and Ilocanos and all of the Macabebes and all the different people who live in the Philippines, even just on Luzon, are pretty divided. And anyway, they get into this fight, and when it turns into a conventional fight, I think that Arthur MacArthur is a division commander in that fight. He might be brigade at first, and then he rises up through the ranks and becomes the overall becomes the Philippine department commander for a while, and he's overall in command in the Philippines during the bulk of the Philippine insurrection. This is when Frederick Funston goes and captures Emilio Aguinaldo, who's so this is think of it like sort of like the Bin Laden raid, only Funston captures him and brings him back, which is an interesting thing.
That's interesting.
And he brings him back, and when he leaves, it's this crackpot scheme, and he tells Arthur MacArthur about, hey, what we're going to do is we figured out where his headquarters is. He's asking for reinforcements. We're going to dress up our Macabebe scouts like they're reinforcements for him, and we're going to pretend to be prisoners. We're going to march into his camp and take him. And he does this. And Arthur MacArthur's thing is, okay, General Funston, I fear I'll never see you again.
That's fascinating.
Rolls back into Manila Bay on the Vicksburg on the ship to Vicksburg with Aguinaldo. Interestingly, this is a total aside, although it does kind of relate. Frederick Funston Jr. and Emilio Aguinaldo Jr. both matriculate at West Point in the same class. There's a picture of the two of them. So the guy who captured the guy who captured the father of the Zins, they're in the class. So the two of them are on the steps at one of the steps, I think at Thayer Hall or something at West Point, which is really interesting. I don't think Aguinaldo graduated, but
it's fascinating.
He did. So
yeah, this is fascinating.
That's something too, right? That there's Filipino students going to West Point. So the connection that's going on here. So there's that other aspect of just how interconnected the United States and the Philippines, where it really is American, and just the whole idea of the United States, that the plan. I'm trying to remember the exact. Yeah, I think the idea was that the Philippines was going to get its independence. Was it planned for 45? Is that right? That was the agreement I think they had come to.
Yeah.
And then, so the United States has to go fight back into the Philippines to give it its independence that was planned, and they stick to that, which again to that credibility of what the Americans are doing, and MacArthur's certainly a part of that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. This is really fascinating to me because I didn't realize just how deeply Douglas MacArthur's roots in the Philippines extended. And so these examples about his father and the connections with the Filipinos is really fascinating to me. So, how do we assess MacArthur's leadership after the fall of the Philippines, and not just for the duration of the war, but especially as director of Japanese occupation? John, I know you wanted to jump in on this especially.
And I'm embarrassed that at the outset, when you asked what is his greatest moment, that I didn't mention this, but this has got to be way up there. If sometimes people look narrowly at his insistence that the emperor not be prosecuted, which there were probably grounds for going after the emperor, although it's still very fuzzy, the extent of the emperor's culpability. But MacArthur made a reasonable point that it was going to be much easier to reform Japanese society if the emperor remained as a figurehead, and I think he was right about that. When you look at actually what was accomplished in the period of the occupation, it was a tremendous amount. I mean, a land reform that completely transformed the patterns of land ownership in the country. The breakup of the old zaibatsu, although many of them came back in another form. The destruction of Japanese militarism, although to be fair, militarism had essentially been destroyed before he landed. It really, so much of the Japan that exists to this day, it really owes its start to the reforms that MacArthur oversaw. So I really think that was a tremendous accomplishment. And I always love when I teach Japanese history to show that famous photograph of him standing next to the emperor. The emperor wasn't happy with that at all and wanted it to be reached. Well, no, he said, "Well, I don't want this." The emperor issued an order saying no one should be able to see this photo, and MacArthur overruled it. I said, on the contrary, I want this photograph to get everywhere. And if you're not familiar with this photograph, look it up. It's very famous, easy to find on the internet. The emperor is wearing a business suit, not his old ceremonial gowns, and standing next to MacArthur. MacArthur just towers over him, and the emperor looks a little uncomfortable. MacArthur is not even wearing his dress uniform. He's kind of got a slouch to him. He's completely at ease. And this, of course, he had already ordered that the emperor would say, "I'm not a god," which he did. But aside from this announcement, if there was any way to lay out to the American people, to the people of Japan, who was really in charge, that photograph did it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you mentioned earlier his admiration, in a way. You and Tom both, I think, mentioned his admiration for the people, the Japanese, not just the Philippines, but the Japanese. So that had an effect on his in many ways sort of soft approach, not always soft, but generally soft approach to reforming Japan.
There's no doubt in my mind that he admired Japanese culture a great deal. In fact, I think this was when he was chief of staff. He used to dress in a kimono in his office in Washington.
Trying to visualize that. Well, we have about 10 minutes or so left, and I don't mean to rush things, but sort of segueing to from the end of World War II and the occupation of Japan to his leadership in Korea. How is it that he is appointed? And I apologize for not knowing the technical term here. Commander, Tom, correct me on these things. I apologize, but not sure what his title is in Korea. But how is it that he comes to be in charge essentially of operations in Korea? And then what do we make of his? I mean, we've talked about his accomplishment with the invasion at Incheon, but if you want to say more about that, please do. But also, When I'd like to hear both your thoughts on when and why things start to really go bad between MacArthur and Truman. So I'm asking you to talk about a lot in 10 minutes. I apologize.
I'll give you, if you want me to do the real quick on the back. So for people who have this kind of interest in broader interest in American military history, this how the United States kind of carved up the world after World War II, where they start to have more formal these more formal what we now call combatant commands. He has Far East Command is his command, and he becomes it's U.S. Forces Korea is one of the names for it. He's the UN command. He's got a lot of hats that he wears.
I see.
The thing about, and I think a guy named Michael Froman wrote a book called Truman and MacArthur, which does this really, really well. A few years ago, he talks about, to a degree I hadn't really realized, if you think about MacArthur as an Asia hand, the guy who's so focused on Asia, the fall of China, communism, really affected him, and he was obviously very strongly against this and hostile to what had happened, and he really wanted so for him, the perspective, this broader perspective for him is from the jump of this, is that he's not that concerned about Korea. He's really concerned about China, and he's in particular concerned about using in some way assisting the nationalists who are now on Taiwan in going back to China. So in order to kind of visualize this, he's kind of angling really from early on. We tend to get focused on once the Chinese come in, which I think he's kind of happy about, because he's like, hey, let's make this what this is about anyway. We tend to focus on whether or not he can bomb over the Yalu and use tactical nukes and all of this stuff. But if you kind of turn the map almost 90 degrees, almost 180 degrees, and you think of he wants the Taiwanese, the nationalists on Taiwan, to do a landing back on the mainland, almost like an Incheon, behind the Chinese forces that are now in Korea, and he's kind of pushing from this early on. So the point of this is that he pushes this as a strategy for winning the Korean War, when in the reality is that he wants a whole new war, a war with China. That the United States would play a much larger part in supporting the nationalists, so that they can get it back from the communists. And this is where the tension is. This is where it starts to build. He starts pushing for this. Once they kind of stabilize, from his perspective, once it stabilizes Korea, he's kind of uninterested in Korea. That's not really his point. And he starts pushing for this, and he keeps pushing for this. And this is what the issue is. This is why you get Omar Bradley saying this is the wrong war, the wrong place, the wrong time, because he's literally talking about starting an entirely different war. That's the tension. It's not so much disputes about how to win in Korea. He wants to start a war with China, which is even though you can kind of say, yes, obviously the Chinese are in Korea and we're fighting them, the United States is fighting them. It's still over Korea, not over China itself. That to me is where you see the tension. That precedes the war. That precedes the fighting. He's actually kind of pushing for that stuff even from his position in Japan prior to the war. He's kind of, hey, we're going to help them get back.
I didn't realize that. That's amazing.
And I think this connects back to his long fascination with Asia, and he sees Truman in the late 1940s taking all of these steps to shore up Europe against communism, and he is one of these who is deeply critical of that, or not so much critical of what's going on in Europe, but saying you're ignoring Asia. And then you see what happens after Truman's reelected in 1948. China becomes communist in 1949. The Korean War starts in 1950. The Soviets also in 49 test a nuclear weapon. There's this sense that the world that seemed like it was under control up until around 1947, 48 now seems to be falling apart. And this also explains why there are a bunch of conservative Republicans who are willing to look to MacArthur for leadership, saying Truman has messed things up by focusing exclusively on Europe and letting Asia go to hell. Now, here is MacArthur, the one man who knows what to do in Asia, and Truman is ignoring his advice.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And we've asked or posted two speeches, or one's the radio address from Truman on MacArthur's firing, and the other is MacArthur's, is it his farewell address, I believe, or his speech before Congress. Yeah, farewell address to Congress, where they both kind of make their cases as to why the other person is wrong. But when I read Truman's radio address explaining why MacArthur had to be fired, it's funny. Of course, I guess as president, he can't give the kind of detailed answers that you both did. But it kind of makes it sound. Truman kind of makes it sound as though MacArthur's just he's a warmonger. He's dangerous, and he is absolutely refusing to listen and obey political authorities on these questions, and specifically the president's orders. That he's this rogue character who is no longer going to abide by the decisions of the commander in chief. Is that a fair assessment by Truman of MacArthur? And how does MacArthur respond to that?
Yeah.
No,
Look, Tom, why don't you take this, Tom?
I think it is. I think it is a fair assessment. I think historians have come to the general consensus that it's a fair conclusion on Truman's side. Although it is worth remembering that at the time that is not the view. I think up until maybe George W. Bush or something, I think that no president leaves office as unpopular as Harry Truman. I mean, he's like his including Richard Nixon. I think he actually has. I think Truman had worse approval ratings than Richard Nixon when he left office, which is sort of stunning when you think about it. And in this large part, it's because of this. It's because of this perceived failure, this unwillingness to win the Korean War on the terms that. And I think this is largely based on a misunderstanding, like I've said, that the view is that Truman wouldn't let MacArthur win the fight in Korea against the Chinese there, misunderstanding that the fight that MacArthur wants would require a World War II type effort on the part of the country, and he's not about to pay that price. I don't think the American people are all that interested in paying that price if they knew what it meant. I think they thought, hey, who's out there that's good enough? And plus, we have these nuclear weapons that can't. These atomic weapons. Why can't they can handle this? We can do this. So that aspect of it. And in case it's always one of these funny little things that, in case you don't believe how unpopular Truman was and how popular MacArthur was, I have and the perception of the Korean War, which has also changed for us over time. I have two movies. One is Back to School. Has that why didn't we?
Oh yeah.
I won't quote it. It involves
with Professor Turgeson's, right?
Professor Turgeson, right? That's because Truman and Rodney Dangerfield tells us because Truman is too much of a bad word to let McCarthy go in there and blow out the common bastards. There's that one. He says, "Good answer. Good answer." Good answer. Like the way you think. It was the great Sam Kinison. And then the other one is Heartbreak Ridge, which is that these veterans of Korea and Vietnam say, "Hey, we're all 1-1." Going into Grenada, which Heartbreak Ridge is a Clint Eastwood movie. And they say that, hey, our record's 1-1. So at best, Korea is a tie. And in part, it's this dynamic of what MacArthur is promising. You go fight wars to win them. Well, I mean, the purpose of the American contribution, the United Nations contribution to Korea, is to preserve an independent, non-communist South Korea. And they win. They do that, and as history has shown, pretty effectively over time. Not perfectly, obviously, because North Korea continues to exist, but there's this promise for a minute that we could do more, and then that fades once the Chinese come into the war, because it's just not worth the cost to do it. So we're back to the initial purpose of the war, but we still have this impression for a long, long time, that this is at best a tie, so it just goes to show how powerful MacArthur. So whatever we say as historians, going back and looking at this, it is worth keeping in mind in this debate between Truman and MacArthur. MacArthur wins pretty decisively in terms of the debate for a long time, a good 50 years after this event.
Yeah, that's a great point. Two great pop culture references too. Very useful. And Anne points out that again, I think it was Anne pointed out that Truman as president, even after firing MacArthur, she says was very generous in allowing him to have a parade and to address Congress. But MacArthur before Congress doesn't back down a bit, right? But I've always wondered in that speech, MacArthur famously says, the purpose of war is victory, right? You don't go into war not aiming to win. But is he talking about the Korean War in light of what you were just saying, Thomas, or is he referring to this larger war, which involved a much broader swath of Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so that's
maybe that's an unfair question, but
no, I think he is saying. So this is the trick in our system, in our terms of civil military relations. When it comes to victory in war at the political level, that is determined by policymakers, not by military leaders. What does victory mean? What is an acceptable end of this mean? And so for Truman, victory is and for that matter Eisenhower, and for most people who are responsible at those highest levels, victory means preserving South Korea. That's good enough. We're calling that victory. That achieves our policy aim in this war. And what MacArthur's not saying is that he's saying victory on my terms. There's no substitute for victory, but he means victory on his terms. And on his terms, that actually means taking the war to China and removing this threat altogether. So that's kind of what he's getting, but that's not the way most people read it, I think. So, or at least for a long time.
Look, if you look at that speech, he's talking about Europe and Asia as two fronts of the same war. So he's clearly talking about a global conflict that ought to be fought with the gloves off. This is really MacArthur's position, and the popularity of it among the American public is really a reflection of this discomfort that Americans had with the idea of a limited war. Right? Their experience with war was World War II, and before that, World War I. It's simple. There's the enemy. You go and destroy him, and you do whatever it takes to do that. So it's not surprising to me that Americans get frustrated with a war that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of progress. You have a guy who's out there saying, "Here's the answer. We ought to bomb China. We ought to unleash John's forces." It's not surprising to me that the American people found that appealing as a way out of this situation.
That's a great point, John.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Tom, please.
I was going to add to that. I think it is a great point. And the other thing to keep in mind about this era, this is a new era for the United States in one sense. So I think John's right. Even though the American people have this perception sometimes, and when they have that perception that you go and you fight a war and there's no such thing as a limited war, you go and you fight and grind it out until you win. That perception is the dominant view in wars where the American population is involved, is directly involved. And we have plenty of examples in American military history where the United States military goes out and fights these limited wars for limited objectives, and the American people don't even know really what's going on. Actually, the Philippines is kind of an interesting example of this in the first case, because MacArthur doesn't get this lesson out of it. But initially, when they go to the Philippines as part of the Spanish-American War, they're made up of a bunch of regiments drawn from states. And very quickly they go, "Hey, look, we can't have the 20th Kansas here anymore because the people at home are going to get real impatient with this." So they send all of those guys home, and they offer to whoever wants to stick around, and they transfer them over to the volunteers, and then sometimes to the regular army. And it's a different, even its name, right? Volunteers, as opposed to this Rose Guard units. And they do this very deliberately because they know that there's less of a connection, less of a demand to win the war and bring them home. Kind of thing like, "Hey, look, this is going to be a slog. We got to do military government. We need volunteers." And so then nobody tends to demand volunteers come back home. Keep in mind, though, in Korea, this is the era of the first time we had a peacetime draft that even preceded Korea. We have a draft, which means that sort of by default throughout the Cold War up until the end of the draft in 1972-73, all of these wars are by definition wars that involve the American people because there's a draft the whole time. So that emotion, that need to fight the war, get it over, bring them home, tends to apply when the sort of civilian population, not professional military, is involved. And that sort of helps explain why you get these sort of different narratives of American military history. You get the Max Boot kind of version, Savage Wars of Peace. American power's about to rise. All these small wars, we do it all the time. No big deal. Well, those are generally fought by professionals, volunteers, people who signed up for it. When it involves the people, like when we have a draft in the Cold War, this peacetime draft, it's a big chunk of time then they start to get real antsy about it, and it starts to feel like it's a big war because the people are involved, and that tends to drive that feeling. And that's why we get that. I think that's part of the reason why you get all the angst you do about Korea and Vietnam. And I would even say, to a certain extent, about today, because the precipitating incident for both for Iraq and Afghanistan for us was the September 11th attacks, which made the people feel like it was their war. But then we didn't call out volunteers, which created all kinds of mental tension among the American people. It was our singular focus as a country on this war, but we weren't actually involved. So it caused this. So the professional military fought it like a limited war, but the American people kind of wanted it to be more absolute, driving towards objectives. So that caused a lot of tension we've had over the last, I'm going on 20 years now.
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating assessment. So, yeah, a lot of great points from both of you on these questions. So we've kept you over quite a bit here. We started a little bit late, but maybe as a wrap-up question, I wanted to circle back to this question from Julie, who says her school is named after Douglas MacArthur. What can we use from MacArthur to help inspire pride or leadership in our school? So we'll end on a positive note, I hope, maybe.
What?
John, go ahead, please.
I'll go back to his role in post-war Japan, which was extremely important, not just for U.S. history, turning an enemy into a close friend, but critically important for the history of Japan as well.
Great, thank you. Tom, final thoughts?
If you go to some of these readings, I think one of the things about some of the duty, honor, country stuff, whether or not we think that MacArthur exactly lived this or liked it or was all of this the way that he should have been, and it goes into that the reading we gave about the 42nd Division too, and what he's talking about, what we fight for stuff. He's an example of some inspirational leadership in some hard times. That he's he says the right words, and sometimes just saying the right words, whether or not we totally buy that he believes them all the time, is kind of enough. There's something there that you can quote him, and whether or not he's the most perfect example of this, because who is the most perfect example, right? And we say this all the time. George Washington owned slaves, and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. We still take their words and we use them, and we say, hey, look, the principles that they're talking about stand for more than what, and then they stand for more than the imperfections of individual humans allow. So in this case, he says and does a lot of things that are pretty inspirational and are pretty worth pondering and thinking if this is the way you would like. This is an honorable and good way to live a life. And to approach your sort of your service relationship with your country, and it can be pretty inspiring that way. And that's sort of in the aggregate, we do better than we do when we just look at some of these the clearly flawed individuals, and that's present company, me included. I'm not by any means perfect. So Douglas MacArthur, not a perfect man, but in many ways an inspirational one, in many ways a very confident one, worth studying, worth understanding. But just keeping in mind the whole story.
Well, that's really well put. And gentlemen, I thank you both very much for your time and your thoughts today. This is one of these topics I actually wish we had another hour to keep going on this, but I know you're both busy. But thank you very much. It was very, very interesting, and I learned a great deal. So thank you.
Thank you. Be well.
Okay.
Thanks again for listening. Our next Saturday webinar, and in fact the final Saturday webinar in our American Minds series, will take place on Saturday, May 2nd of 2020 always at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It will be on author Ralph Ellison. So we will complete our American Minds series with a 20th century author. Given the situation with school closures and so much going on right now with the COVID-19 virus, we are running a number of other webinars during the week, actually. We have started a series that we are running every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern on topics in history. We're calling it Insights from History. And these individual programs are about different events in history that we might be able to draw some kind of insight or wisdom or perhaps at least some perspective that'll help us understand and grapple with the events that are unfolding around us. The next in those series comes up on Wednesday, April 8th, as I said, at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will be about economic interventions during times of emergency. You can find out information about all of our upcoming webinars at tah.org/program/webinars and from our homepage at teachingamericanhistory.org or just tah.org. Thanks again for joining us.